Do you think silence in a family says more than shouting?
I did not throw a glass of wine across the table, nor did I storm out of the dining room in dramatic silence when my brother called me a failure. Instead, I sat there with my fork balanced over my plate of half-eaten roast, my lips pressed into a calm curve that only I knew was loaded like a spring. And I let the word circle the air until it settled in the center of the table like another guest no one had invited. Evan had spoken loudly enough to cut through the clinking of silverware, so that every single person, our parents, our cousins, even the wide-eyed niece scrolling under the table, had heard the insult in perfect clarity. He wanted it that way, because humiliation only counts if it echoes. The worst part was not the word itself, but the timing, the way he leaned back in his chair, tapped his knife like he was ringing in a toast, and presented his judgment as if he were conferring some great truth upon the family. Chelsea, his ever-smiling wife who treats life like a feed of curated moments, chuckled nervously and touched his arm, the way someone strokes a dog after it brings back a dead bird. My mother pursed her lips, torn between smoothing over the ugliness and keeping her floral centerpiece upright. My father gave me a quick look, a silent plea not to ignite anything, because he has lived long enough to know how hard it is to clean ash out of carpets. I swallowed the last sip of water in my glass and let the moment ride. Failure at what, exactly? I asked, my voice steady, almost curious, as though I had simply asked him to clarify a recipe. At life, Evan said, grinning so wide it seemed rehearsed. At business. At everything you touch. He said it with the smugness of a man who has never once doubted whether applause would follow his jokes. A few nervous giggles broke from the cousins, not because they found him funny, but because people often laugh when they are cornered. I smiled and asked for the bread basket, as though we were discussing the weather. But under the table, my hand slipped toward the little paper sticking out beneath his phone, a folded receipt, careless and crumpled, yet marked with scribbles that only someone like me would notice. The name of a banker was scrawled across the bottom, along with a half-legible note about renewal dates. I slid the paper into my napkin without anyone noticing, tucked it into my lap, and continued eating. Outwardly, I was quiet, even gracious, the sister who knew how to take a joke. Inwardly, I was already tracing the outlines of his company's fragile scaffolding. Evan liked to call himself self-made, though our parents had refinanced their house twice to bail him out, though I had spent weekends helping him sort invoices before he ever hired a bookkeeper, though his marriage looked less like a partnership and more like a press kit. I had cataloged every debt, every boast, every slip of arrogance he scattered over the years, but I had never thought I would need to use it. Until now. Don't take it personally, my mother whispered while passing me a plate of beans, her voice drenched in the same pacifying syrup she had been feeding me since childhood. Evan's just teasing. He never means it. He meant it, my father muttered from behind his glass, not looking up, but the words carried the weight of someone too tired to sugarcoat anymore. It's fine, I said evenly, because fighting at the table would have given Evan exactly what he wanted. I'm not upset. And the truth is I wasn't, not in the way he expected. Rage would have been too easy. What I felt was colder, sharper, something that hummed quietly in my bones. When dessert was offered, I leaned forward and smiled at the server. Actually, we'll skip dessert tonight. But please, charge everything to the Heart Logistics rewards account, I said brightly, looking directly at Evan. He had made the mistake months ago of announcing to the entire family that they could use his company's loyalty program at any dinner because brand exposure is priceless. Now he sat frozen, forced to smile through the tightening of his jaw while the server nodded and walked away. 18 meals of appetizers, entrees, and overpriced wine would land squarely on his business ledger before the night was over. Public optics maintained, private finances rattled. While the cousins argued in the living room over whose turn it was with the controller, I lingered in the kitchen, stacking plates with my mother. What are you going to do? She asked softly, worry etched between her brows. Nothing loud, I said, drying my hands on a towel. I'm finished with loud. She exhaled in relief, believing me. My father did not. By the time coats were being collected and hugs were exchanged at the door, my phone vibrated. A voicemail from an unfamiliar number. I pressed play as I stepped onto the porch, the cool air biting my cheeks. Hi, this is Thomas Beck from First Lake Bank. Sorry to call on a Sunday, but I'd like your perspective on a shared connection. It's time sensitive. His voice was smooth, professional, yet edged with urgency. I replayed it once, the phrase time sensitive pulsing in my ears. Evan clapped me on the shoulder as he passed, grinning like a monarch forgiving a peasant. No hard feelings, sis. Just keeping it real, he said. I smiled, not with forgiveness, but with clarity. Of course. You gave me exactly what I needed. He laughed, not understanding that by the time the ink dried on whatever paperwork was already in motion, he would learn what failure really looked like, only it would not be me wearing the label. I woke before sunrise with the kind of clean purpose that feels like a locked door clicking open from the inside, and while the house breathed that lazy Monday stillness that always used to make me think nothing urgent could happen before coffee, I sat at the kitchen table with the crumpled receipt smoothed under my palm, the banker's name written in hurried ink like a breadcrumb a fox might believe was clever camouflage, and I began to make a list that did not look like revenge so much as housekeeping, a thorough sweep of corners no one dusts until a guest arrives. I wrote down First Lake Bank and the date scrawled near the word renewal, then added the vendor stamped at the top of the receipt, a steakhouse that doubled as Evan's runway for pretending debt was glamour, and beneath that I wrote the names I could summon in one breath. Lena from the supplier side who had texted me last night, the old controller whose resignation never read like a choice, the warehouse foreman with a limp, and a memory for promises that never cleared accounts payable. By the time the light inched across the countertop, I had a neat column of people who remembered facts without filters, and, because I have learned that the only thing more valuable than outrage is a calendar, I started booking my day like a surgeon with a full slate. I texted Lena to meet at the little park near the river where runners pass without making eye contact, a place where a conversation can be private because it looks public. Then I called the old controller. A woman named Avery who always wore flat shoes and kept a pencil behind her ear like something might need balancing any second, and I left a message that did not sound like a favor, just an invitation to sanity. At the park, the wind came off the water with a chill that made the cheap coffee taste like it had a point, and Lena arrived with that walk suppliers have when a client has forced them to grow up too fast. She hugged me like people do when they have bad news that is not theirs alone to carry, and she did not waste time with small talk because small talk dies around past due invoices. She told me the part one expected, that Heart Logistics had stretched terms from net 30 to net 60 without earning it, that a couple of Friday wires had quietly slipped to Monday and then to midweek, that a seasonal spike had been promised in a deck but never delivered in trucks, and then she told me the part that made my fingers go still around the paper cup, which was that a rumor had started about a cure period clause in a key contract that would trip the minute a covenant from First Lake tightened, a clause written by someone smarter than Evan who understood that cash flow has a heartbeat you can strangle with a thumb. I did not gasp or clap at the rhyme of it, because melodrama belongs to people who think preparation is a surprise. Instead, I asked for dates, thresholds, contact names with titles, and any email subject lines she could remember that might be worth fishing from an archive. Lena gave me enough to build a skeleton, and I thanked her the way you thank the person who points out the exit in a smoky theater. She asked whether I was going to burn him down, and I told her I was going to open a window and let the pressure do what pressure does when you stop pretending you are not in a sealed room. The voicemail from the banker kept tapping at the back of my head like a polite woodpecker, so I called him from a bench that gave me a view of the river and a good look at my reflection, because sometimes you need to see your own face when you are about to lie by omission. He was cordial in the way bankers are when they want to learn without revealing, and he asked if I had any perspective on Heart Logistics leadership because the bank valued stability above personality, which is code for we are watching your brother shout on social media while his margins whisper. I said I could not speak for leadership decisions, not formally, but that I had historically seen a pattern of optics outpacing operations, and before he could convert that into a note for his file, I pivoted and asked what the bank's renewal rhythm looked like this quarter, whether they were adjusting risk tolerance in the distribution sector, whether silent partners were suddenly louder, because I have discovered that framing a question like empathy loosens tongues better than flattery. He told me, not quite off the record, that the credit committee had begun asking for cleaner receivables and faster reporting, and that any chatter about delayed payables would force a narrower hallway, which sounded like a sigh if a sigh could write term sheets. I thanked him and did not promise anything, then walked to the train with the kind of slow certainty you feel when you know the next move is not a leap, but a measured step onto a staircase you built when no one was watching. Avery called back while I was underground, and when I surfaced she was already mid-sentence, apologizing for not replying sooner because she had been on a call with her new employer where people said please and meant it. She told me she had left Hart Logistics after Evan's habit of sprinting past guardrails turned from charming to hazardous, and that she had boxed her conscience into a neat rectangle of spreadsheets labeled contingency. And if I wanted to see where the bodies were not buried but filed, she could meet me at lunch with a thumb drive and a sense of humor that had survived on sarcasm and herbal tea. We met at a diner that smells like butter and old police reports, and she slid into the booth with a face that had done the math and decided truth was cheaper. Over a plate of eggs that looked like they had been convinced to be optimistic, she sketched the mechanics, a line of credit rolling toward a date that would not forgive creative accounting, a major shipper whose cure clause allowed them to walk if a covenant twitched, a lease renewal on the secondary warehouse that a real adult should have renegotiated before football season, and a pattern of brand-forward spending that kept the feeds glossy while forklifts needed maintenance. She did not gossip, she briefed. I asked the questions that matter to people who count things for a living: aging buckets, days sales outstanding, vendor prioritization under stress, and she answered without the defensive fog I had braced for, because Avery had no forgiveness left for theatrics. When the check came, I paid in cash because there are days when paper feels like respect, and she pushed the thumb drive across the Formica with the casual grace of a magician demonstrating there is no trapdoor, only competence. If you want to help the employees, she said, tapping the metal like it could hear, make sure whoever steps in treats them like the asset on the balance sheet everyone pretends people are. I told her that was the only part one cared about more than accuracy, and she looked at me the way a tired nurse looks at someone who brought real shoes to a disaster. On my walk home, I composed the message that would plant a seed in Chelsea's perfectly curated garden, because small revenge is useful not as a headline, but as a rhythm section that sets the beat under the melody. Evan had promised on camera, during a holiday charity drive, that his company would cover community meals for veterans at a neighborhood hall every first Monday of the month, a vow made with bright lights and easy applause. Except the accounting folks had quietly capped the reimbursement and pushed the paperwork so far back the volunteers had started paying with personal cards. I drafted a clean, warm email from a generic community account to Chelsea's public relations inbox, praising the past support, attaching photos of smiling faces, and politely reminding them that tonight was the first Monday, that the hall had already posted the thank you in anticipation, and that the invoice would follow. I CC'd a local reporter who lives for feel-good stories with sharp edges, the kind that make brands either step up or stumble. Within an hour, Chelsea replied with exclamation points and a promise that Hart Logistics would, of course, honor its monthly commitment immediately, and moments later a text from Evan arrived that sounded like teeth grinding behind a smile, thanking me for looping in the press because community matters, which translated to the cost landing on his books before close of business and the narrative locking his hands in front of his own audience. As dusk flattened the street into a painting, my phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number that did not bother with pleasantries, only a sentence that felt like a door clicking in a different hallway. If you genuinely want to keep the warehouse team whole, call me tonight, bring a pen, and do not tell your brother you are coming. The unknown number belonged to a man named Miguel Alvarez, a shift lead who had been at the secondary warehouse since the days when Hart Logistics was still a handful of leased trucks and an overconfident dream, and when I arrived at the coffee shop he had chosen, a place that smelled like burnt sugar and caution, he was already seated with a spiral notebook open to a page so carefully kept it felt like an accusation, and he did not waste time with apologies for reaching out because men who Manage loading docks in winter, do not have the luxury of small talk when payroll feels like a coin toss. Miguel spoke in paragraphs that had weight because every clause carried a person's mortgage or a child's inhaler or a grandmother's grocery list, and he laid out, with the simplicity that only comes from long practice, a pattern of delayed maintenance tickets, a schedule warped by overtime that got promised and then reclassified into categories that looked generous on a chart but felt like theft on a Friday, and a spreadsheet of suggested route consolidations that would have reduced idle time if anyone upstairs had bothered to count minutes instead of likes. He was not interested in revenge. He was interested in continuity, in making sure the people who kept the veins of the operation flowing did not learn the hard way that loyalty has the shortest shelf life of any consumable good. And I listened with the kind of attention that stops feeling optional once you notice how easily a well-lit mission statement can erase a third-shift human being. Miguel's notebook contained a copy of a vendor schedule that should have been locked behind an administrative account, and when I tilted the pages I saw, as clearly as if someone had highlighted it for me. The narrow window where a supplier grace period overlapped with the bank's covenant test, which meant that a single week of cash discomfort could ripple outward into a failure to meet a contractual promise, and that failure, documented with the clinical neutrality lawyers prefer, could hand a partner the right to walk away without looking like a villain, because paper has a way of laundering intention into inevitability. I asked him whether anyone else had this view, and he said the former controller had hinted at something similar before she left, adding that she had walked around during her last week handing out little pieces of practical advice like she was tucking life jackets under chairs on a ship the captain still believed was unsinkable, and because I had already met Avery. With her eggs and her thumb drive, I told him there was a path if we were surgical and quiet. After Miguel left for his shift with a cautious kind of hope that looked almost like suspicion, I called a number I had not dialed in years, a number that belonged to a buyer who specializes in boring profit and unglamorous truth. A man named Carter Vale who once told me that the only reliable fireworks in business are the ones you do not set off, and I asked him whether he had an appetite for a mid-sized distribution company with decent bones, bruised cash flow, and a charismatic liability at the top. Carter does not perform enthusiasm, which is part of why I trust him, and he asked for three things: clean access to receivables aging, a read on supplier patience, and clarity on the bank's tolerance for performance poetry from founders. And I told him I could deliver the first by tomorrow, the second by dinner, and the third as soon as my voicemail with the banker became a calendar invite with an agenda that sounded like transparency. He said the quiet words that move mountains: send me a term sheet skeleton and a map of the covenants, and then he hung up to do what competent people do, which is build scaffolding before anyone looks up. Before I started stitching together the deck that would not insult the intelligence of a credit committee, I allowed myself one small, pointed pleasure, a revenge so gentle it wore the costume of mentorship. Because I have learned that the sweetest way to undercut a bully's storyline is to lend the microphone to someone he has spent years pretending was scenery. Evan had been invited to speak at a regional logistics luncheon, a modest event that he liked to treat as a stage for his mythology, and the organizer, who still had my email from the season I did volunteer ops, had sent a panicked note that morning asking whether he might submit slides before midnight because her board had grown allergic to improvisation dressed as expertise. I replied that Evan was regrettably overbooked, but that I could recommend a far better speaker with real ground knowledge and a gift for explaining the kind of granular efficiency gains that actually move return on invested capital, and then I connected her with a patient, clever analyst named Priya who had written 3 internal memos that Evan never read, and who, given a podium and an audience of people who sign checks, delivered a blueprint so lucid that 2 competitors tried to poach her before dessert. The luncheon posted a highlight reel that evening, and while Chelsea dutifully reshared it with language about teamwork and elevation, I saved the clip where the applause swelled as Priya fielded questions with unembellished facts. Because there are moments when a single quiet transfer of power rings louder than any gotcha. With a thumb drive from Avery, notes from Miguel, and a set of supplier emails compiled into a narrative that did not lean on adjectives, I drafted the framework Carter wanted, a plain English memo that walked through the leverage points without gloating. Because the game here was not vengeance for its own sake, but stewardship disguised as a rescue, and if anyone asked me later why I did not simply call my brother and beg him to straighten up, I would point to years of calling and begging and straightening and watching the same arc bend back toward spectacle. I built a short list of board members whose signatures mattered, including an uncle who had a minority stake he liked to pretend was a hobby, and a retired teacher who had lent principal savings with the belief that community is a capital class. And I drafted letters that explained, with careful formality, the consequences of doing nothing versus the outcomes of a controlled transition, and though I felt the faint prick of being judged as cold, I reminded myself that mercy for a showman can be cruelty to a payroll. Late that night, while I was still juggling files and renaming them in a way that would not embarrass me when printed, my phone lit with a notification that Chelsea had posted a celebratory carousel about a record quarter at Heart Logistics, complete with a bright office photo and a whiteboard scribbled with revenue figures so perfect they might have been designed by a brand consultant, and as I looked closer, something small and familiar made the back of my neck prick, because beneath the numbers was a date in the corner of the board that did not match this quarter at all. A neat little timestamp from months ago which, in trying to dress up the present, had accidentally confessed the past. The morning after Chelsea's careless carousel, I woke to a feed already buzzing with congratulatory comments. Investors and friends applauding numbers that looked immaculate on the surface, yet carried the unmistakable stain of repurposed data for anyone who cared to look closer, and as I stared at the date etched in the corner of the whiteboard, I knew I now held a thread that, once pulled, could unravel the whole garment without me needing to raise my voice. I spent hours at my desk assembling documents into a shape Carter could present without embarrassment, building a narrative of steady but fragile operations that would appear salvageable to his conservative board, while simultaneously forwarding a private package to the bank officer who had left me that tentative voicemail, a package that carefully framed the mismatch between public declarations and private performance not as scandal, but as risk exposure, which for a financial institution is a far more damning word. It was not rage guiding me, but the deliberate motion of someone laying bricks in a narrow hallway, brick after brick, until the passage inevitably closed on the person walking blindly inside. By noon I had a call scheduled with the bank's credit committee liaison, a woman whose tone told me she had endured years of founders overselling growth, and when I quietly pointed to the discrepancy in the posted figures and the real receivables aging, she responded with the kind of long pause that feels like a hinge on which someone else's fortune turns. She did not thank me directly, nor did she accuse, but she asked whether I thought Heart Logistics had a path to operational stability under current leadership, and I said, with a measured calmness that sounded like resignation rather than glee, that charisma rarely pays invoices, and that perhaps the right steward with a steadier hand could preserve value where noise only consumed it. I knew she would repeat that phrasing in a memo, stripped of my name but heavy with my fingerprints, and that was enough. While the bank began to retreat into its corner, suppliers started shifting too, their patience thinning once whispers reached them that the line of credit might no longer be a given. And Lena texted me to confirm that her company had just shortened terms back to net 30, a subtle move that on its own looked routine, but in the delicate balance of cash flow meant the pressure gauge was now turning red. These little adjustments were the equivalent of removing air from a sealed room, and though Evan strutted online with another polished story about partnerships and resilience, the numbers he refused to honor would soon reveal themselves in silence where wire transfers should have spoken. Meanwhile, inside the warehouses, cracks were beginning to widen, and Miguel called to tell me that Evan had erupted in a fury after discovering a key shipment had been delayed because a maintenance issue grounded 2 trucks that should have been serviced weeks ago. Rather than addressing the problem, he barked at the crew until one of them filed a complaint with HR, and though that file might have been buried under usual circumstances, the timing meant it would now circulate among people who were already weighing whether continuity was possible under his watch. I realized that what had begun as personal vindication was now acquiring momentum of its own, the machine of accountability moving because multiple levers were quietly being pressed at once. And my role was no longer to shout, but to ensure the rhythm stayed steady until the last beat landed. That night, I sat at my dining table surrounded by papers, contracts, covenant summaries, and the skeleton of a term sheet Carter had asked me to refine. I outlined the conditions under which his firm could assume ownership: acquisition of debt at a discount once the bank agreed to transfer, continuation of essential staff under existing pay, and immediate replacement of leadership. The document was dry, clinical, and absent of gloating, yet every sentence carried the pulse of justice disguised as due diligence. I added one last clause requiring the creation of an employee fund to cushion the transition, because I could not allow the people who had hauled Evan's illusions into trucks and onto highways to bear the brunt of his downfall. It was my way of keeping the revenge clean, a scalpel instead of a hammer. Still, even in my calculated calm, I allowed myself one more act of small satisfaction. I knew from Avery's files that Evan had been sitting on overdue requests for forklift repairs, requests that never made it past his desk because he preferred photo opportunities with polished vehicles rather than messy invoices. I called a contact in a local charity that supported warehouse workers and anonymously funded a maintenance grant that would cover immediate repairs, making sure the story reached the crews not as a reprimand of Evan, but as a sign that someone unseen valued their safety. The grant bore no name, no attribution, yet I knew word would circle that while the man at the top shouted, someone else had quietly tightened the bolts, and that rumor alone would begin to erode the myth he clung to. As the night grew late and I gathered the documents into orderly stacks, my inbox lit with a message that broke the rhythm of quiet control. It came from Evan's attorney, a man who typically reserved communication for bland updates or threats wrapped in civility, and the subject line was curt: Cartervale. Inside, a single sentence landed like a pebble breaking the surface of still water. Who is Cartervale, and why is he asking due diligence questions about your sister? My hands froze over the keyboard as I read it again, realizing that the paper net I had been weaving so carefully might already be visible to the man still thrashing in the center of it, and that the next move would decide whether the trap closed smoothly or snapped too soon with both of us tangled inside. The email from Evan's attorney did not arrive like a thunderclap, but rather like the faint rattle of a loose window in a storm, a reminder that even the most carefully laid plans cannot remain invisible forever. And as I stared at the single line that asked who Cartervale was and why he had dared to whisper my name, I knew the veil of silence had begun to thin. Yet instead of panic, what I felt was an almost surgical clarity, the recognition that every step I had taken, every receipt pocketed, every file assembled, every whisper nudged toward the right ear, had been building toward a moment when secrecy would no longer be necessary, because inevitability was now stronger than concealment. The following days unfolded with the precision of clockwork that had been wound years earlier, even if Evan believed it had only started with his careless insult at the family table. The bank, now armed with the evidence of his recycled numbers and restless creditors, quietly executed the leverage transfer that allowed Carter's group to step into position as the stabilizing force. Suppliers, already tightening their terms, sent polite but unmistakable signals that they would welcome firmer leadership, and employees, bruised by Evan's temper and buoyed by anonymous gestures of support, began to shift their loyalty toward a future that no longer needed his voice to function. The atmosphere in his company changed almost overnight. Meetings that once revolved around his posturing now carried the quiet focus of people preparing for a transition, even if they could not yet admit it aloud. On the morning of the closing, I arrived at the nondescript conference room where such transfers always happen, a space chosen precisely because it looks like no story could possibly begin there. Evan entered in his usual theater of confidence, shaking hands too firmly, laughing a half-beat too loud, and brushing off the stack of folders as though paperwork could be bent by charisma. Yet as signatures began to accumulate on the documents arrayed before him, his smile grew thinner, his eyes darting toward his attorney with the unspoken question of whether the tide could still be reversed. When the final page was turned and Carter, calm and deliberate, slid the executed agreement across the table, I watched as realization dawned on him in increments. Not like lightning, but like a tide soaking into shoes you thought were safe from the waterline. When my moment came, I did not raise my voice, nor did I deliver the kind of triumphant monologue that people in movies mistake for victory. I simply handed him a letter on the new company's letterhead, formally notifying him that his employment had been terminated effective immediately, with cause outlined in terms that lawyers prefer: breach of fiduciary duty, failure of oversight, and conduct inconsistent with the preservation of enterprise value. He read it with the disbelief of a man who had built his life on the certainty that consequences were for other people, and when he finally looked up at me, his face carried not just anger, but confusion, as though he were still trying to calculate how the sister he had called a failure could be the one who had orchestrated the room that now closed around him. I did not gloat, though part of me wanted to remind him of the word he had so carelessly thrown across our mother's dining table, because I knew that revenge spoken aloud too often curdles into pettiness. Instead, I thanked him for the years of lessons he had never meant to give me, the education in watching someone mistake attention for respect, and then I stood and walked out before his response could catch me. Because the point of my plan was not to win an argument, but to end the story on my terms. Later that evening, as I sat in my father's garage with the smell of motor oil grounding the air, I slid a sealed envelope onto his workbench, one that contained copies of the documents, letters of protection for the employees, and a note that explained I had begun preparing for this long before Evan's insult had lit the final spark. Years earlier, after he had nearly bankrupted the family with one of his reckless expansions, I had started tracing his patterns, not out of malice, but out of the quiet certainty that one day his collapse would be unavoidable. And I wanted to be ready not just to shield myself, but to protect the people who would otherwise be crushed beneath him. My father read in silence, his hands steady, and when he finally looked up he said nothing, only gave me the kind of nod that carries the weight of complicated pride. As for Evan, he would recover in some fashion, because men like him always find another audience, another stage, another room willing to believe until the pattern repeats. But this time the company was no longer his to endanger, and the people who had carried his illusions were no longer bound to the fragility of his ego. Whether I had acted purely out of justice or out of vengeance, I could not answer with certainty, and perhaps that ambiguity was the truest ending of all. Because the question that lingers is not whether my brother deserved what happened, he did, but whether in delivering the lesson I had become something colder than I intended, someone who solved betrayal not with forgiveness, but with precision, and left the room without looking back to see what parts of herself she had sacrificed to win.